So I think we should begin with a definition of what sight reading actually is. And for me, I have to go back to really the mentors. And they may not be people that I knew, but they're mentors in our pedagogical profession. So I turned to Richard Chronister, and he said, sight reading is coping with unexpected change. It's playing the notes, rhythms, dynamics that you know, but in a context that you have not played before. And this is a really wonderful way to think about sight reading. In other words, we've seen the notes before, we've seen the rhythms before, we've seen these patterns before, but they're in a new context now. And when we can deal with those new notes and rhythms and rhythmic patterns and dynamics in the new context and cope with that unexpected change, then we're reading well. Two very well-known researchers in this area, Andreas Lehmann and Victoria MacArthur, they wrote that sight reading is the gap between each person's ordinary level of rehearsed performance and that same person's ability to perform at first sight. And they suggested that the smaller the gap, the better the sight reader. And of course this is true, but I think it's just good to remind ourselves of this. Often with my students, the rule of thumb that I use is I want my students to be able to sight read well, accurately the first time, a piece that's about 2 levels below the challenging repertoire that they're working on throughout the semester or throughout the course of several weeks. So that reading, that sight reading, is a couple of levels below. But ideally, the smaller that gap, the better. And finally, I thought I'd turn to Francis Clark, the true founder of our modern American piano pedagogy. And, you know, this is not a new issue. A writer wrote into her questions and answers column in 1966. And the writer wrote in saying, I have an advanced student who really doesn't read well. What are your suggestions? And of course, Francis Clark immediately said, can a student really be advanced and a poor reader? It's a good question to ask. But then she went on in her column and she asked some really good questions about where the student may be misunderstanding or where the gap may be. So she asked, does the student see patterns? Does the student see the patterns as the same or different? Is the student really comfortable with the topography of the piano? And this is important in many keys. Is the student looking ahead? Sometimes our students' eyes become fixated when they're sight reading. They become fixated on certain notes or on one clef and they ignore the other. Clark asked if the student was looking at bigger groupings or reading single notes. She asked if the student needed glasses. And I see this in my studio quite a bit. When I have a student who's doing sight reading, I can tell if they need glasses. They start leaning forward. They start missing notes that I know they wouldn't miss ordinarily. Clark also asked if the student was technically prepared. This is a very astute question. In other words, we can't sight read something that's technically beyond our ability. And then she also suggested that perhaps because this student was playing more advanced repertoire, maybe the student needed to play much easier sight reading until that skill was developed, but let's make the sight reading longer. And she even suggested that perhaps the actual repertoire that the student needed to work on should be easier, though longer, to ensure that some of these gaps that may be discovered were really being filled in a meaningful way. So what are the components of sight reading? So I'll start with the cognitive perspective here. First, there's perception. So when we are seeing notes on a page, we don't really just take a picture of the page the way a camera does and see a fully formed picture. What we see are dots and lines and squiggles and dynamic markings, all of these many different things. And our eyes move back and forth, up and down, and hopefully very quickly take in some patterns and find meaningful patterns within those notes. In fact, that's what our brain really does all of the time. You know, from the time we're young children and babies, we're studying our environment, our visual environment, and trying to find meaning and find patterns that we recognize. We want to see things we recognize. Recognition feels good to us and feels good to the brain.